Greetings and welcome back. And today I turn to the second page that is titled Power, the Currency of Politics. And one of the things that I think a lot of people get confused about is they make the assumption that power and force are the same thing. And I will tell you that I'm even guilty of this sometimes. For example, one of my favorite quotes regarding power is by Al Capone. You certainly don't think about Al Capone as a political philosopher. Al Capone was a gangster in Chicago. But Al Capone is famous for his saying that a smile will get you a lot, but a smile and a gun will get you a whole lot more. And of course, you can hear power all through that statement. But it is true. Smile can get you a lot. Um, I know my daughter, for example, when she was 4, fell in love for the first time. She fell in love with McDonald's, which she called Mickle Donald's, and with Arby's roast beef sandwiches. And my, oh my, that smile or a hug or giving me a kiss and saying, Daddy, I love you. And the next thing I knew, we were at McDonald's. So certainly, uh, my daughter exerted a lot of power over me, right? As I have listed in the notes, it's the powers of behavior. It's the ability to get someone to do something they wouldn't do otherwise. And so, for example, I wasn't planning on going to McDonald's. I wasn't planning on going to Arby's, but I did many, many times because my daughter was able to figure out that a smile and a hug could get her a whole lot. Thank goodness she didn't discover the gun part. But I know I directed, gosh, it's a long time ago, in the 1980s. I was the youngest academic director of the U.S. Fulbright program in America. So we had scholars from all over the world come to Davis, and we would introduce these scholars from throughout the world to American government and institutions. We would introduce them to the norms of American universities, for example, because American universities tend to be run different than European or African or Asian universities, for example. And we had scholars from literally all points on the planet. And it's intriguing because I would start out the orientation by asking them about their notion about, what is America? And I know the Germans were always intrigued by the American West, so they would often refer to, again, this is in the 80s. Today, I don't think this would be true, but to John Wayne or some other Western star. Uh, my Japanese and Asian scholars both mention McDonald's. Um, I know my old office partner worked for the U.S. State Department one time, and he said that when he thinks about American imperialism, he thinks about culture, about Hollywood. And he talked about how he was in the remote jungles of the Amazon, and they had a remote generator going on in a TV, and they had a very, very scratchy, you could barely see the screen, but it was an old TV show, The $6 Million Man, that they were watching on this TV, and they were far enough away from the city to where they could barely get reception with this generator uh, driven electricity to power this little TV. So I want you to think about power as a behavior, and I've listed 4 different ways in which power can be exerted. I'm not sure that this is an exhaustive list, but I think it's a long enough menu to give you an idea that power comes in various forms. It comes through hard power, as it's often called, and here I'm stealing from Joseph Nye, who I had an interesting conversation with in Chicago many, many years ago, who was a professor at Harvard University, and his partner Joseph Cohane. They wrote a path-breaking book called Power and Independence at one time. Essentially, they challenged the notion that power was just force. That traditionally in international relations, for example, people thought of power as military power, as war, rioting, terrorism, and certainly, as you can see in your notes, that is an element of power, force. If I were to ask you on the exam about force, it is the exercise of power by physical means, war, rioting, or some other form of violence. The thing that made Cohane and Nye so interesting is they said that they believed in the long run this was far less effective than what they called soft power. Soft power would be persuasion, exchange, and to a lesser degree manipulation, which are all on your list. And what Cohane and Nye argued is that in the long term, you're far more effective at influencing people through culture, through diplomacy, through foreign assistance, through disaster relief, etc. So persuasion is second on your list of the currency of politics. Persuasion. This is the nonviolent use of power where the person who is trying to exert power over you makes it very clear that they're trying to influence you. So this would be things like lobbying. If you are a representative, for example, and I've had conversations with several representatives over the years who have said, here's what we want you to do. And I was thinking about doing this at one time, primarily through the union, but we were told if you want to influence people, you want your information to be short, preferably on one page. You want to make the appeal quick, easy, persuasive, because you don't have much time, and frankly, they don't have much time. But when you go in representing an organization, it's very clear, and they know what you're trying to influence them to do. When you go to a debate, it is very clear what both people are trying to do. They are both trying to convince you that they are correct and their opponent is incorrect, and that they want you to support them. A great example of this from American government, and whether you took American government from me or whether you took American government from someone else, I am sure that you talked about the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were a collection of 85 essays, you may remember, written by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, and their initial purpose was they were trying to influence the delegates at the New York State Ratification Convention to ratify the Constitution. Even though that purpose originally was very narrow, those essays spread throughout the colonies and people were aware of them throughout the country. There is a huge debate about how effective the Federalist Papers were. In fact, most people believe that they didn't change very many minds. But certainly, the Federalist Papers are an excellent example of persuasion. There is an attempt, and people know when they read these that the purpose is to support the Constitution. So we engage in persuasion in our lives daily. We try to convince people to do certain things or not to do certain things, depending on the circumstances. The third that I have listed is manipulation. This is a nonviolent use of force, but the actor is trying to conceal their use of power. There are several examples of manipulation. I will give you a few of these. For example, for many years, there were gay and lesbian activists who claimed that Hollywood had an agenda that was trying to basically stigmatize a gay lifestyle. So the couples were all uh, heterosexual. They didn't say this, but I would add the couples were almost always of the same race, for example. And now I am pleasantly surprised. Maybe there's an attempt to manipulate us because in recent months, I have been surprised at how many commercials now have interracial couples. It seems like, for example, there are a lot of commercials that have black and white couples. Now, having come from a segregated society in Kentucky, I see this as welcome that people would view one another as individuals and not by something as superficial as skin color. Now, whether this is manipulation by Hollywood or whether they've just become more open minded and they don't care, it's intriguing. A great example politically was many, many years ago when Ronald Reagan was president. There was a critic within the Republican Party, and President Reagan was a conservative Republican, and one of his critics was a conservative Republican. His name was Pete Domenici. He was a senator from New Mexico. Senator Domenici was known as a very, very thoughtful, he understood budgets very well. And Domenici said that Reagan's budget did not make sense, that uh, you could not increase defense spending and give a tax cut and balance the budget, that it was kind of the forerunner to what eventually became known as voodoo economics. Reagan's people, Ghost wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal, and it made it appear as if the Wall Street Journal itself was criticizing Domenici. And Domenici had great respect for the economists at the Wall Street Journal, thinking that if the Wall Street Journal economist thought he was wrong, maybe he should back down. And it silenced Domenici, and Reagan's budget was passed. It was only later, once the budget was passed, that Domenici found out that it wasn't the Wall Street Journal editors at all, that it was Reagan's people, and that they had manipulated Domenici by getting him to believe that it was actually the people at the Wall Street Journal. So, manipulation, like persuasion, is nonviolent, but you're trying to conceal that you're doing this. Now, my personal favorite of these four is the last one, and that's exchange. This is the use of power through incentives, bribes, log rolling, right? For those of you who don't remember an American government, log rolling is this informal agreement between congresspersons where I will support your bill if you will support mine. There are lots of examples of exchange. I know many years ago there was a Cash for Clunkers program where the government was trying to get older cars that were not very environmentally friendly off the road. In recent years, there have been federal and state tax incentives to incentivize the use of solar power. And for example, on my cul-de-sac, there are now a couple people on the cul-de-sac who put solar panels up. And as I drive around my neighborhood, I'm increasingly see these because there has been an attempt by the government to get people to change their behavior, to use solar power. It's not a new concept. Many, many, many years ago, when I was at UC Davis, it seemed like parts of Davis were almost a solar city. Solar was being used to such an extent in Davis, but I think that was more a concern about the environment. And increasingly, the government has used incentives, in this case, economic incentives, to change people's behavior and to use a renewable energy source like solar. So when you look at power, don't think of power as just force. Power is not just violent. Power can be nonviolent, it can be persuasive, it can be manipulative, it can be through exchange, it can come through culture, it can come through economics, and obviously, yes, it can at times come through war or violence or intimidation. In the next mini lecture, I will turn to governments and power.